last comments that Maggie was making, the foundational points about seeds and nutrients and increasing the toolkits to provide for the practitioners who are doing the hard work, and how all of that needs to be integrated more effectively to drive impact, I think sets us up well. Thinking from the framing conversation for today's food forum, Dr. Fowler laid out so well how food insecurity has direct and cascading impacts on individuals, their families, societies, and can contribute to not only undernourishment, but to migration, to conflict, and how we all need to start thinking about this a little bit more holistically and differently, that food security is health security. It is national security. And Iffath, I'd like to turn to you first to build on that a bit. And in your work with the World Bank, how are you seeing food insecurity directly tying to development outcomes? And what are you seeing in your work, particularly in fragile contexts around the world?
Thank you, Allison. So you said it, right? Food security is also development policy. And Dr. Fowler mentioned 700+ million people living in food security right now. But a similar number are actually living in extreme poverty. And poverty and hunger are intertwined challenges, especially in fragile context. And what is the impact? Really, the impact is that what we know from research, that a malnourished child will have a 17% decrease in his or her annual income in the course of their lifetime. So that is development, right? That tells you how much countries can lose if they don't have the right nutrition, the food security for its population. We know, and this is completely avoidable. And I think that's why I'm so excited to be here to talk to everyone, because we now have the tools and policies to really look at mitigate that to the best of our abilities. And why this is important, because in fact we have a measure at the World Bank we call Human Capital Index, which is really a way for countries to understand how much potential they're losing by not giving a child the right health and education. In fragile contexts, when you use that measure, we see the stark inequalities between countries that are poor, that are in fragile context, compared to high-income countries. We heard about Sudan. Right now, we have 25 million people living in food crisis. Sudan's Human Capital Index is 0.38. What that means is a child born in Sudan now will only be able to achieve his or her potential by only 38% of what he or she could if she had good nutrition, access to food, healthcare, education. So that's really why this is a development challenge. And I hope that tells you why this conversation is so important.
So well said, and the impacts are profound when you put it that way. It's very clear. And we see these issues manifesting around the world in fragile contexts in various respects. And when we're talking about low and middle income countries, it's so important how to apply lessons learned, the toolkits, and integrate efforts. And also, there's a lot happening here as well in the United States, which is among one of the richest countries in the world, but also with pockets of extreme poverty and fragility and hardship. And so, Sanah, I'd like to turn to you and your work with USDA. How are you thinking about that, and how is your work really targeting those communities who are vulnerable and fragile?
Well, thank you, Allison, for having me. And it is a delight to have food innovation and science be so centered in the conversation about how we move forward at the intersection of climate and food security. I would say that question around equity and fragility drives us every day as an administration and really as a Department of Agriculture. That is part of our mission. But we really haven't centered equity in the underserved in the ways that we have really needed to over the past many generations. And so we came in not just to advance and uplift and re-energize our science portfolio and really deploying and developing these solutions, but to really look at the data. And so every 5 years, the USDA releases and conducts the Census of Agriculture. And we just released our latest results of the 2022 census, which actually paint a very dire picture for farming communities and farmland and really everything that you can think about in agriculture, which include the fact that about 90% of farmers in America today have to take off-farm income to feed their families. 50% of farmers are in the red based on farm income alone. The number of Latino farms and Black farms in particular continue to decline. Our farm operations on average are getting bigger, and we have lost about 151 million acres of farmland over the past 40 years. We're not going to get that farmland back, right? These questions about what do we do with this really have to go to global partnerships, innovation, but really thinking about how do we work with our academic partners and extension to make sure that the solutions that we're coming up with can get into the hands of the producers that need it most. But we are really trying to tackle this issue head on with an equity commission, the first ever that Congress really mandated that we work with, and they issued a set of more than 70 recommendations that we're systematically going through to figure out how do we make our programs, all of our farm loans, and our research more equitable and more representative of all of the communities that we serve.
And a lot of lessons that can be learned and applied elsewhere as well.
Exactly.
And so for that reason, I'm really excited to have so many experts from different organizations, different perspectives and journeys for this integration. And Jonathan, I'd like to turn to you. Clearly these concepts are complex and the challenges are great. How can we think about this in terms of an organizing principle and ways of strengthening food systems, but also at the same time providing social protections so that those who are in extremely fragile environments and are at risk of great shocks, so that they're better positioned to respond, adapt, and transform their systems and become more resilient to be able to address those kinds of shocks and disturbances.
Thanks, Allison. So, the aid community itself is quite projectized when you get out there, right? And especially in fragile contexts where there aren't strong ministries necessarily or agencies to kind of pull everyone together, you get a lot of fragmented, kind of uncoordinated efforts. And a lot of those efforts are now turning slowly towards resilience. We heard about toolkits, but what we risk is having just a sea of toolkits floating around as well, and a sea of principles that sometimes confirm that there's a path to resilience, a kind of a pivot in the organization, but sometimes leave you wondering, maybe it's just development kind of redone again. So you hear sometimes about inclusion, you hear about agility, you hear about self-regulating. These are all principles that can serve resilience, but they can also serve development as well. And so what we really need, to your question, Allison, is real organizing frameworks that are shared across major partners that can say, let's take a portfolio approach. Let's take an approach where we all come together with the right stakeholders for dialogue and planning, for mutual accountability with government and stakeholders and donors, and let's really figure out how we do resilience. So what are the major risks in a certain place to the food system and to the social protection system? I think this is such a relevant conversation because it's really these two pillars that are going to be supporting fragile places until they're not fragile. The food system is the system for food. It's for livelihoods. It's for regulating a very complex political economy because these are largely agrarian economies. And the social protection system is really the backbone to coping. If you don't have that, in places like Ethiopia, for example, you're really in the tall grass. So over time, there has been the evolution of a common framework. But interestingly, because I think the aid community is a bit fragmented, we haven't joined it up yet. But it's a framework that USAID shares, that we have in our new global program model at FH, that the UN has recently published common guiding principles on for country teams. And it's really around three central capacities that we need to build for resilience to really take hold. These are absorbative capacities. So can you absorb a risk? Can you absorb a shock? Can you prevent it or mitigate it? Through infrastructure, through insurance products, through savings groups and social networks that can kind of bind together in times of crisis and be on the front lines as support to each other. An adaptive capacity. In Ethiopia, we lead a resilient food security initiative for USAID called Preserve in Amhara, which is very conflict affected, very drought affected. And we help to support multiple value chains for potatoes, for teff, for various varieties of crops, in part because it's food, it's sustenance, it's nutrition. It's also potentially commercialized, so it's income. But we found that when one or two of these crops are compromised because of a conflict, we have other ones that we can rely on to keep stimulating the local economy and keep the food reserves up. This is what we mean by adaptive capacity. Getting to the goal of food outcomes when one way of getting there is compromised. Do you have pivots to another way of doing it? And the last one is what we call transformative capacity. Can you do things at a scale, right? The evolution of the safety net from just providing support to the poorest to becoming adaptive and being able to switch quickly from poor to disaster affected, or in some cases sustaining both portfolios, is a transformative capacity because it's really big. Transformative capacity could also mean taking something that was a risk or a crisis and turning it into an innovation, right? So in Guatemala, where I was just recently for a resilience forum that we hosted, they have so much flooding. They've now created hydroelectric power plants that convert the flood zone, that kind of take away the flood risk and generate electricity out of it as well. So because this framework is shared but kind of in fragmentation, I think what we really need to do is come together at country level and HQ level and start saying these should be the framework from which we then break silos and find new ways of working together.
That's great. And so I think we've laid out the why clearly, and also these organizing principles, and that's a very helpful framework, I think, to think about these things. And so the next question, of course, then is how, and what are the tools, what are the instruments by which that integration can happen? And so, Iffath, I'd like to turn back to you, and with your work at the World Bank, what are, very concretely, some of the instruments, some of the social safety nets, the tools, cash transfers or insurance, that are having an impact and helping those who are in fragile contexts to absorb and withstand some of those shocks?
So no, thank you. Let me organize my thoughts in three buckets. One, talk about innovations, and I want to thank Jonathan for very eloquently describing the innovation that I want to talk about, and then talk about the impact that we see on the ground. And then looking forward, because I was really struck by our earlier panelists talking about that science is scale neutral, because how do we get to scale? And that's where I think the next horizon should be for us. So, in terms of the tool, Jonathan, you mentioned this adaptive way of looking at things. That's exactly where the World Bank, over the last 15 years of our work, when I look at what we've been able to do country after country, is build this, what we call adaptive social protection system, right? And it's really going from this project to a country nationwide system. And this we actually, the reason why I think it's such a powerful tool to bring that integration and anchor some of these learnings we're finding in the food system is that these models, we call them delivery system because they are really a way to deliver services, whether it's income support, whether it's information capacity, whether it's offering literacy on financial literacy, offering women coaching, mentoring to help them move beyond just having protection to really promoting their ability to be more resilient, having employment opportunities, to really have more agency over their lives. And I think we heard Dr. Fowler talk about how many women are involved in these agricultural systems and how this is so important. So we now, to my mind, these adaptive social protection systems, delivery systems are really a highway for us to channel all the information we need with the right financing to really reach scale. Just within our own work, our own portfolio is about $30 billion, and we work in 72 countries. We are covering 250 million people. Half of them are women. this just tells you the potential of reach that we have, that we could really be bringing in new technology, climate resilient, whether it's seeds or practices through these mechanisms. So that's kind of on the innovation. And we also know the impact. So in country after country, we've done a lot of impact evaluations in really hard to reach contexts like FCV. So, you know, the modular approach we use in terms of trying to offer some cash transfer support, some income support, and then we layer it with additional support. We call economic inclusion approaches. All of that together, what we see in our latest research from Niger, which is not an easy country to work with, that $1 of investment is able to give us $1.27 back, which is not only do you get the $1 back, but you're adding 27 cents into the economy. Multiply that by 100 million. You actually are able to lift communities out. That is powerful. In Senegal, what we see, again, similar interventions are actually increasing consumption by 15%, income level by 25%, savings, assets. So in a way, this is what I meant, that this is the evils of malnutrition and food insecurity can be addressed. And so that's kind of the impact. And let me leave you with the innovations in financing, because to reach scale, you need innovations in financing, and there we really are working with many partners, and you mentioned the importance of partnership to bring together also financing innovations to really reach the scale we need, because, you know, we're still, with even $30 billion, we're still a drop in the ocean because the need is so great. We have an ambition to reach 500 million people in the next 5 years, and so we are really working with partners to think about how we really leverage the different approaches and the different financing tools that we have to really go to scale.
That's incredible, and I love your energy about what you're doing and the impact that it's having. And I think you described really well, you know, the innovation with social safety nets, and also, you know, I think important to underscore the return on that investment, because they're often, I think, thought of as a cost. But to be able to very clearly articulate that return and how much it's needed to strengthen the system as a whole is incredibly important. And so, as far as health systems strengthening is concerned, and the tools that we're trying to understand a little bit more, what are the mechanisms? How does this work? With USDA, I know, of course, this is UNGA, but it's also Climate Week, and I know USDA is working very much and aiming for climate. And so would love to hear a little bit more about the work you're doing and those mechanisms and the tools that are strengthening the resiliency of food systems that are really under stress, particularly from climate.
Well, first, I love the way that you framed that, and I love the focus on ROI, because I think people don't recognize that for the United States, for example, every $1 invested in public ag R&D generates $20 of benefit for the economy. So we know that we have an incredible return on our investment in terms of driving public science and development of these solutions, and yet, unfortunately, we're declining in those investments, and we're worried about that. But one thing that we are optimistic about is really the power to convene and to bring global leaders together through really the first ever effort to integrate climate resilience and nutrition insecurity, and figure out what do we do to deploy and develop those solutions. So Aim for Climate is the agriculture innovation mission for climate. Aim for C was launched by President Biden a couple of years ago. We're entering our final year. It was a 5-year initiative to really raise our global ambition and really say, we will not ever be able to meet our climate accord agreements and keep warming under 1.5 degrees without agricultural innovation. We simply cannot do it. How do we do it? How do we engage governments? How do we engage private sector partners? How do we engage philanthropy? We now have more than 600 partners joined on to Aim for Climate. We have more than 56 governments. So it was incredible to bring all of these agricultural ministers together to DC for our conference on Aim for Climate last year, which is the first time we had ag ministers at that level talk about climate change and talk about it from such a diversity of perspectives. So we have multiple innovation sprints, and I encourage you all to look at aimforclimate.org. We have a new report out that also is really laying out a roadmap for the future and saying, hey, there are countries and partners kind of as pushing forward this work, but as nations develop their NDCs, they really should be thinking about food and ag innovation and investments. So the $17 billion that we've been able to cultivate and generate through Aim for Climate globally should be the baseline. You know, we can't just say, okay, great, we did that, now let's kind of move on. That should be baked in, and we should raise that ambition further. And so we're really thinking about a way to make this model sustainable. And I want to thank the UAE, who have been our partners with USDA and the State Department. They have launched kind of a new effort called Aim for Scale. And you're right? Science is scale neutral. But having governments and philanthropy, I know they're working with Microsoft to really figure out how do we deploy, how do we scale. And Her Excellency Al Mahiri yesterday with Secretary Vilsack was talking about working on something like a chat GPT for farmers, right? How do we take all of the science and research and information that we have through CJIR, USDA, all of these global partners in the private sector, and then allow especially the most underserved, hard-to-reach farmers, and they don't have access to advisors and extension, right, to be able to have in their language information that can make them profitable and to make them more resilient, right? And so that's kind of what we're trying to do with Aim for Climate. And the other thing I want to say is platform and investments, making sure we're talking about this is important, and we need to be investing in the next generation. So one of the things that we're so proud to have been able to do is to launch the Next Gen program at USDA, which is going to train 20,000 young people over 5 years that look like America. Because we know that we need to reach, and it's investments, $250 million dollars that we've invested in minority serving institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, historically Black land grants, and tribal colleges, because we know that exposure gives them the opportunity to take this work on, and we need them represented at the table. So these 20,000 future leaders, we're also building pathways within government and hopefully within all of the private sector partners that we've assembled through Aim for Climate and philanthropy to really drive the future forward.
And drive intergenerational change and capacity building in that way, which is absolutely incredibly important. Jonathan, I'd like to turn to you to talk to us a little bit more about the organizing frameworks, right? So when you're thinking about the safety nets, the health system strengthening, and the tools, how does diversification as a concept help us to kind of understand how can we integrate all of those efforts more effectively and more rapidly to drive the impact that was being discussed?
If you look at, so diversity as a principle can be kind of a hack when you're looking at the food system. So from the production side to the processing all the way up to the market. If you start with the production side, you could say, do you have a diversity of seeds and crops? If you put them together through intercropping, they can actually become more resilient to shocks and stress, but they can also create opportunities for livelihoods, commercial crops and more nutritious crops that aren't as commercial but are there for nutrition. And Ambassador Fowler talks a lot about that. We can also say, what are the food landscapes that we're investing in? Some cases it's land-based, but when there's droughts, you have big problems. So what about aquaculture as well, and vertical farming, greenhouses? If you have a portfolio blend of those, you're increasing absorptive capacity as well. I mentioned a second ago about the value chains and how they can become very adaptive. So if you have multiple value chains and one is compromised by disaster, you have others to rely on, you're much more resilient as well. And at the kind of transformative level, if you have multiple trade agreements where you can be accessing food and having a portfolio where you've got some food grown domestically as a buffer against price shocks on the foreign market, you can be resilient. If you have food that you're able to grab from foreign markets when yours is compromised, you have resilience. If you bring them both together, you have strong resilience. If you do it apart, you don't. Because if your domestic crops are damaged and you have no ability to get something on the other markets, then you're in trouble. So that diversity concept, I think, is very powerful to kind of think through how we build resilience in the process.
We've got about 30 seconds left, so I'm going to do a quick speed round, and so that we leave on a high note. All of your energy is palpable, and it's exciting to think about the innovation that's happening, the work that you're all doing, and the ways that you can partner together to drive that impact. And so if you could crystallize that in what excites you most about the work you're doing and the opportunity to collaborate with others to more effectively partner, streamline and integrate the operations and the supports with the health or with the food system strengthening, what would you pinpoint and what are you optimistic about?
I'm optimistic generally, but I think the opportunity to better link with philanthropy as a federal government. We don't always do that very well across the board, and especially on the science side of the house. Seeing increased investments across philanthropy and ag innovation, across all of the kind of diverse ways that you've laid out, we're embracing that a lot more. And I think it is a great opportunity to actually fill those spaces and those gaps that we know and not duplicate and really extend and make sure that we can deploy the solution. So I think that there's a culture change happening in that. The other thing I would say is really finally a recognition that it's not just emerging technology and innovation, which is important, but as a 15-year-old amazing young woman from Hawaii said, is AI to her means ancestral intelligence. So really thinking about merging those two things, right? The emerging new science and technology on the cutting edge, and how do we learn from the indigenous peoples and practices? And we're really driving forward a lot of tribal research partnerships at USDA that I'm excited about.
Love that. Iffath?
I'm interested about 3 Ps. I'm excited of that now policy is starting to come together and integrate, and I think that's great. I'm excited about the new program design that we're putting together, linking social protection with food systems. And I'm really excited about partnerships. I find there's a moment where social protection is being recognized by different sectors as a multi-purpose tool to get access to many services to poor and vulnerable people, and I'm super excited about those partnerships. And I want to really thank you for this exchange, because we often don't speak to across sectors, we speak within sectors. So I think this is excellent, and thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of the resilient food systems work that we've done in the past didn't have the social protection connection. I didn't mean to rhyme that, but it just worked out nicely. So what it was doing was you would have cash injections that are also safety nets, but not formal safety nets involved in the program. In Ethiopia, we are actually linking the formal social protection system as part of the injection of funding that we want to see in the resilient food system work that we're doing. And we're using a lot of that funding and supplementing it, layering it with our own cash transfer schemes, grants, and loans to build people's reserves, cash assets, et cetera, to help to build that absorptive capacity, but also to do the kinds of work, like the cash for work kinds of programming of social protection, to build infrastructure for resilience, to rehabilitate degraded lands, to build watersheds as well. So we're changing that whole ecosystem using the safety net, and we're also at the very local level helping to create grievance systems and feedback systems between local populations and that system itself. More transparency and more metrics as well. So it's really exciting to see that transformation happening on the ground. And given where we are at Rockefeller, I find one more thing that's really exciting, if I may. There's this commitment from the World Bank and the African Development Bank right now to reach 300 million Africans with electricity by 2030. Mm-hmm. And Rockefeller has pitched in an accelerator fund amount, where that fund is going to try and bring the banks together. When they asked the new executive director what his role is going to be, he said to be a pain in everyone's rear, to kind of move it forward. But I think having some kind of accelerator, some kind of body that is the intellectual capital, the framework holder, and helps bring everyone together and de-silo them, could be very, very powerful as well.
So we need a Rockefeller to do an integrator accelerator for us.
If you're listening.
Yes, if you're listening.
Social
thank you
protection
all.
and food.
Right, exactly.
Really appreciate not only laying out the why, this is really important, but very importantly, the how and what needs to happen next and how you can all work together to drive the impact. So appreciate you all being here, and again, for all of your work.
Thank you, Allison.
Please welcome